Miss Bortner's class is a small, close-knit group of students who are all very comfortable around each other. Many of them are very willing to talk when Miss Bortner is running the lesson. The majority of the students are level 3 and 4, with one student being a possible level 5. To encourage students to use English authentically, Miss Bortner always starts out her class using speaking prompts. Students who are level 4 or 5 are much more eager to speak and are willing to share a lot of personal details. Students who are at a lower level are more hesitant to speak. These students often offer very brief responses.
Around the room and hear your speaking prompts. You want to start us off? No?
All right.
Moving in order around the room was the fastest way to finish this activity, but asking this student to start made her uncomfortable, so I moved to the other side of the room first.
What is the best gift you have received? The best gift I received was my little brother.
Oh, that was sweet. That was sweet.
Some of the students who were very willing to talk when Miss Bortner ran the activity were less willing to talk for me.
And me? Yeah, we'll just go around.
Do you have siblings? Yes, I do.
Asking follow-up questions and engaging in a conversation with the student encouraged them to elaborate on their answers.
How many siblings do you have? Three. Brothers, sisters, older or younger? Good job, guys. So the lesson for today is on root words.
My content topic for this lesson was root words. I chose this topic because a basic understanding of root words can equip students to think through larger vocabulary words they may come across on their own. While it would take a longer period of time and a more in-depth lesson for these students to memorize a large set of root words, through my lesson I aim to teach these students the concept of root words and how to identify them in larger words. My first goal for this lesson was for students to identify the root words in larger vocabulary words, and sort these large words into categories based on their roots. My second goal was for students to, as a group, list additional words that belonged in the root words family.
Have any of you guys ever heard of a root word?
After every student had the chance to speak, I moved on to the topic of the day's lesson.
Okay, cool. So we'll start with the concept. Do you guys know what a tree root is? Yeah. Can anyone describe it to me?
In this lesson, I used direct teaching of vocabulary because of the importance of this topic. However, I used the students' pre-existing understanding of a tree to offer a way for them to visualize this new concept.
It's under the soil.
Yeah, it's in the bottom. So it's the part that holds the tree, and it's the part that the tree grows out of, right? So a root word is a very kind of small, simple word that you often see in bigger words, and bigger words kind of grow around the root word.
Once I had the students thinking about root words as the base of a larger word, I provided an example of a root word and a larger word it is part of.
So this is a root word. It has a meaning, but it's not a full word to us. So in words like, does anyone know what this word means? Does anyone know what this word is?
No.
No, it's kind of a big word, right?
Throughout my semester-long observation of the class, I noticed that many of the students are at high speaking and listening levels, but lower writing and reading levels. Assistance with spelling being one of my most prominent tasks while helping during Miss Bortner's lessons.
This is dictionary.
Oh.
Does anyone know now?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's a
The
dictionary?
dictionary is like a big book of words and what do they mean.
Exactly.
For the words I was presenting as words the students already knew, I had to read out loud in order for the students to recognize them.
So can you guys see the root word inside of this word? See how it's part of it?
Yeah.
So dictionary is a book full with words. Fit can mean words or to say. So can you see how if you knew that what it meant, you might be able to figure out what dictionary meant? How it's kind of like a clue to help you figure it out, right? If you can break the word apart, you can understand how it's spelled and more or less how it sounds.
I wanted the students to understand the usefulness of this lesson in order to motivate them. Misspelling and not understanding words prevents these students from achieving at the same level as many of their peers and causes them a lot of frustration. In this lesson, I aim to offer these students a tool for deciphering word meanings and spellings. To further encourage the students' visualization of root words and words as tree roots and branches, I handed out these worksheets for them to fill out, and drew the image on the board for them to follow along with.
So we're going to start with the root word am. So if everyone wants to write am on the base of their tree, this is your root.
The concept of a tree is something all students living in this area have implicitly learned. This prior knowledge is not subject to language or culture or class. Therefore, I could be sure that all of the students would know it. It was my hope that this all-inclusive visual concept would help these students who may struggle otherwise with the English language.
Does anyone have any clue what am might mean? It's okay. Okay. So I'm going to give you a word that you might recognize. Does anyone know this word?
I used a Spanish example to demonstrate that this concept is not limited to English. Ideally, understanding the concept of root words can help these students identify more roots in their first language, and therefore help them to advance in their Spanish vocabulary as well.
This is actually a Spanish word. Does anyone recognize it now? What does it mean? Love. Exactly. Oh, so the cool thing about root words is that they come from Latin, and there's a lot of different languages that have developed from Latin. So Spanish, English, French, a lot of languages like that all have the same roots. So even if you don't know what the word in English might mean, you can recognize it in the Spanish word too. So am means love.
This would prevent from subtractive schooling and encourage them to continue in their studies of Spanish as well as English. We then moved on to another root word tree, this time for the root word con, with more examples. I provided words whose root was con that the students likely knew, underlined the root in the larger word, and asked the students the definitions of the larger words.
The word that has con is... Does anyone know this word? Connect, exactly. You know what that means? Exactly. So a sentence.
One word I included in this tree was constellation, which was a vocabulary word in the students' previous space unit.
Does anyone remember this one? Concentration? Close. Constellation. Constellation. Does anyone remember that? Yeah? Yeah, it's a group of stars that are come together to make a picture, right? So it's a
We've
group.
been learning about it in science class.
I remember, that's why I picked this word. So you guys, this is a group of stars coming together. Do you guys think when you were learning this word, it could have helped if you had known the root word? Yeah. Maybe it would have helped you remember the definition? Or even now that you know this word, it can help you remember the definition for other words.
After these two trees, I had planned for one more, but I could see some of the students zoning out, as it was the same 3 or 4 answering my questions every time. In response, I decided to switch the final tree with the activity I had planned in order to get all of the students standing up and engaged in the lesson. In order to assess if the students understood how to identify root words, I provided cards with words belonging to 5 different root word families and asked the students to sort them accordingly. To incorporate the idea of a family tree, the large words were names on cards with faces, and the root words were the family names. All of the students did very well at sorting their cards into the separate categories. Some of them had to ask me or Miss Bortner for help, but once we had helped them to identify the root, they were able to figure out which family the card would belong in.
Starting with the bi family, we have binary, bifocals, and bicycle. Do you guys know any of those words? Yeah. Which one you know? Bicycle. What is a bicycle? It's a bike, yeah. Okay, so a bike is a vehicle with 2 wheels, correct? Yeah. And that's why, does anyone know what a unicycle is?
Yeah.
With 1 wheel. It has 1 wheel, exactly. So uni means 1, and bi means 2, 2 wheels.
Once the students had sorted the words, we as a group discussed the definitions of the words and how all of the words in a family can be connected by the meaning of their root.
Now I have a sort of challenge for you guys. You want to try it? I have a word, and it's a very difficult word, and I'm sure you guys don't know. But it has 2 of the root words that we talked about today. So you can look at the board, I can tell you what these root words mean, you can look at your papers, and I want you guys to try to guess what this word means, okay?
To then apply the concept of root word meaning with the student's ability to identify root words, I wrote a word on the board with 2 of the root words we had discussed in the lesson.
So the first step, who can tell me what are the root words inside this word? Yeah? Con, yeah. Do you want to come up here and underline that?
The students identified the 2 roots and their meanings.
What's the other one? Yeah, you want to underline that?
I used the word in a sentence and then asked the students to guess the meaning of the mystery word.
I think this word could mean. Here, you want to go? Yeah. Contact them though? Like contact them? That's a great guess.
This task was a bit challenging for students at lower levels. Lastly, we turned to the final tree in order to assess if the students could come up with other words that fit into the family.
We're going to do one more tree, and I want to see if you guys can think of anything that's put in that tree.
I asked them to offer out loud any examples they could think of.
Yeah, do you guys have ideas? Yeah. What's your idea? Vision? Yes, that's a great one. Vision. Can you give us the definition for that word?
You can see.
Yeah, you can see. That makes sense, right?
Only students who were at a higher level were able to offer new examples. If I were to do this lesson again, I may offer time for them to talk in groups at their tables about this question before asking them to tell me the answer. The smaller group discussion may have encouraged students who were zoning out to focus more, and the examples thought of by other students in their group may have helped them to think of examples themselves. One of the things I learned from this teaching experience was that all students are very different even when they're in the same ELL class. Activities that are planned for ELL students need to vary across the different levels of achievement. Some of the students were actively engaged and participated in the lesson. Other students were not. Small group work and one-on-one help is probably the most useful for these students. While individualized attention is impossible for every lesson, ELL classes offer the extra support these students need.